With JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 7, there's a lot I can talk about. So instead of making a 2 hour long video, I'm just going to make multiple different videos on different topics. The first one that I want to get into that's really going to jump out at people right away is the depiction of Jesus in this part. Jesus actually shows up as a character. His existence is pretty integral to the entire plot of Part 7. I'll briefly just say why Jesus in the world of JoJo did live, he did die, but instead of what we're told in the Bible, Jesus is mummified by Joseph of Arimathea, who then takes the corpse to North America and spreads, like he tears it into pieces and then spreads it out all around the United States of America, before it was the United States. And then throughout the story, people find these corpse parts of Jesus, and crazy things happen, and the main villain, Valentine, is trying to collect the entire corpse of Jesus and integrate it all into his body. It gets really crazy. And none of this could happen without Jesus. The way that it's explained why this happens is that if someone lives a particularly good life, after they die, they can become a saint by having miracles happen that are associated with them after they've already died, and which shows that their bodies have some sort of power still attached to them even though they're dead. There are lots of theories out there. The one I hear the most is that these people were stand users, and now that they're dead, there's still some residual stand energy power left over because they were such a strong stand user. And I think it's pretty heavily implied, if not stated, that Jesus in this world was a stand user, an incredibly powerful stand user, and that's why he was able to do all these miracles and stuff. Which, although a little bit funny, it's also kind of cool. I mean, I would love to see a JoJo spin-off novel or manga about Jesus being a stand user and going around using a stand. I think that would be super cool to see. Which is why I should mention at this point that JoJo's Part 7 is my favorite part of JoJo's. I know that's definitely not a hot take. Everybody likes Part 7, but that's because it's really good. And for a long time, Part 3 and Part 4, they were kind of my favorites, but Part 7's really good. So I want to be upfront and clear that I really do like JoJo's as a whole, as well as Part 7. So I'm not going to try and rip into it, or if I disagree with anything, it's not because I hate JoJo's or Araki. It's all just talking about different subjects. So to get back into it, I find this story of Joseph of Arimathea really interesting because it's pretty common to hear stories about Joseph of Arimathea and what he did after the Bible concludes, because we don't know what happens to him. We aren't told what happens to him. Now, both him and Nicodemus, we know that they were a part of the religious elite of the Jewish people at the time, and they clearly side with Jesus. And once that story got out, once the biblical stories were circulating and people were hearing stories of Joseph of Arimathea siding with Jesus and doing these things for Jesus and believing in Jesus, he clearly would have lost his position as a Hebrew elder, as part of the Jewish elite. He would not have been able to keep that position for long if people found out what he was truly believing. He would have been kicked out, or worse, stoned to death. But we aren't really told what happens to him. We don't get, after he gets and buries the body of Jesus, we aren't really told much of what happens to him. I don't think he dies. I think the book of Acts, it would have been recorded if he had died. But so I think he does live. And I also think that he would have gotten out of Judea or hid somewhere away from the Jewish elite so that he didn't die. But aside from that, I'm not going to speculate much on what happened because we just don't know. We just don't know what he was up to, what he did after the Bible concludes. But since then, other people have been speculating on what he was doing. In fact, there's a lot of speculation that's gone on in the past 2,000 years and more about what biblical characters were doing that we weren't told of. We've got things like the Book of Enoch and the Gnostic Gospels. And of course, we've got a million YouTube videos about what Jesus was doing in those lost 20-some years between when he was a kid and when he started his ministry. Some people say he was in Asia, he was in Japan, he went to India. Some people say he went all the way to North America, he went to Africa, he was in Europe. The truth is, he was a carpenter. He was just working with his dad that whole time. That's all he was doing. He wasn't in a spaceship flying around the planet, going on a fun adventure. He was just building houses. One of my favorite stories about what Joseph of Arimathea was doing was the foundation of Camelot. There's this story that he goes to Britain, he leaves Judea, goes to England, and he founds Camelot by kicking out Muslims hundreds of years before Islam even started. Fun story. Read it sometime. But not what he was doing. He also definitely wasn't distributing mummified corpse parts around various continents, but I think you didn't need to be told that. And I think also what stands out to me and what's really interesting, it was the first thing that came to my mind right when I was reading this earlier part in part 7, is I was thinking to myself, this depiction of Jesus is perfectly summarizing how non-Christians tend to view Jesus. When you ask someone who isn't a Christian, or is like, a cultural Christian, if you ask them about Jesus, they'll tend to give you the same kind of response. Jesus was a great guy, a wise guy, a smart guy, just a fantastic, moral human being, but he wasn't God. All that God stuff he was talking about, none of that, but he was a great guy. Similarly in JoJo, Jesus appears to have not been God because he left behind a body and didn't resurrect. He's still dead. Yet he's apparently so powerful that just coming in contact with his split up body parts can change the very nature of the earth around it and give people superpowers. And there's one part where Jesus actually appears in the spirit to Johnny and talks to him. And then nothing like that really happens in JoJo before. I mean, we see spirits of people, but not in this way. We get the sense that Jesus can just do that on a whim. Like he just has the power to just show up in spirit to people, which, as far as I know, other spirits in JoJo can't do that. They don't have the power to just free range like that. Raimi, I mean, she could appear to people, but she was stuck in the same town where she died. Jesus was on the other side of the planet when he appeared to Johnny from where he died. So why is Jesus so powerful when he's not God? We're just led to believe that he was just a really, really powerful human. And that's exactly what non-Christians see Jesus as, a really, really great human. Really awesome, but human. And I don't think that is a possibility that Jesus allows us to believe. I remember when I was an atheist, I was never really convinced by the argument C.S. Lewis puts out of Jesus was liar, a lunatic, or Lord, because it just seemed like, that can't really be fair. Some people say it's a false trichotomy, but I think there's more weight to this argument than the typical atheist would like to see. And it all hinges around the fact that Jesus really did claim to be God. It was why he died. The reason why he was killed was because he kept claiming to be God. And that, as far as the Jewish people were concerned, was seriously bad if it wasn't true. And they didn't believe it was true, so they killed him. Some people try to argue that Jesus did not claim to be God, that that's some kind of mistranslation, or it was just made up after he died. Lots of people throw that kind of stuff out, but I think it's very clear from historical research that Jesus really did claim to be God while he was alive. Whether or not it's true, that's up to you and God to decide, but I think if we look at the historical sources as objectively as possible, I know that's difficult because we're humans, but if we look at the sources, I think we can conclude that Jesus at least claimed to be God. Partly because we know from the historical sources, from non-Christian historical sources, Jewish and Roman sources, that Jesus really was a real person who lived and actually was crucified. And outside of claiming to be God, we're never given any other reason for why he would have been crucified. So far, all the ancient sources that we've found are in agreement that Jesus died because he claimed to be God. If Jesus did not claim to be God and there was a different reason why he was killed, then you would think someone would have written that down, someone would have recorded that, and we would have found it. We also can be pretty certain that the Jesus we read about in the Bible is at the very least similar to the Jesus that really did live. Of course, as a Christian, I believe it's exactly true, but if we're just going off non-Christian historical sources here, we can be pretty certain that Jesus was at least someone who was known to be a miracle worker, someone who was a rabbi, a teacher, who had very different views, who's going around speaking different views than the average rabbi at the time. And of course, it's these views, particularly the one that he is God, that ended up in his death. A lot of people say, well, where in the Bible does Jesus say the 3 words, I am God? And if he didn't say those 3 words, then he must not have claimed to be God. But that just shows a lack of understanding any of the Bible at all, and I don't think anyone who uses that argument has ever read any of the Bible. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah all the time, and if you read the Bible carefully, the Messiah is God. Of course, the Jewish people at the time thought the Messiah would be a human, but that was because they had misinterpreted the Bible. And Jesus was trying to explain, a lot of Jesus' ministry was trying to explain to people that they were wrong about what the Messiah was, that he was the Messiah and the Messiah was God. The Jews didn't super agree with that, and so they killed him. And it's super interesting to me, because we're not given a reason as to why Jesus was killed in JoJo's. I mean, we know he was crucified because the spirit of Jesus has the holes in his hands, he's got the thorny crown and everything, so we're led to believe that this Jesus in JoJo experienced the same death, crucifixion, and false accusation as the real Jesus. But I guess Jesus in the JoJo world was just wrong about being God because he didn't come back to life. Which then makes me think, if Jesus was just claiming to be God but was wrong the whole time, but he was an incredibly powerful stand user, well, then he doesn't really sound like a good guy. He kind of sounds like more of a bad guy. He's going around lying, or he's crazy and has really strong stand powers. That sounds like more of a definition for a villain than a hero. And ultimately, that's why we can't be in this place where we view Jesus as a good, great moral teacher, but he wasn't God. It's this issue that comes up where we can't believe both at the same time. If somebody goes around lying all the time about something as big as being literally God of all creation, maybe they're not that good of a person. I mean, think of someone you respect, who you think is a pretty great person. If they legitimately started going around claiming to be God, you put them in a mental hospital, you wouldn't continue thinking they're a great guy. You wouldn't go, oh yeah, his teachings are great, I'll live by them. No, you'd think he was insane. And Jesus probably wasn't insane, because then he wouldn't have been a very good moral teacher. I mean, how many people locked up in a mental hospital are spouting the kind of incredibly deep and philosophical ideas that Jesus spoke of? And Jesus certainly didn't talk like he was mentally unhinged. In fact, he sounded more sane than any of us have ever been. So if he wasn't insane, and he wasn't lying, and he must have honestly, at the very least, believed that he was right. But let's say that you believe that Jesus was wrong, he wasn't God, but he at least believed he was God. That to me has always been a very weird fourth answer to this trichotomy. I mean, do you really think Jesus could have been legitimately confused and actually thought he was God? That he could have just been accidentally wrong? It was just an honest mistake. He thought he was God and wasn't. Do you think that could happen to a sane person? I get that at the time, the Jewish people were looking for a Messiah. And Jesus, well, he checked off all the boxes for what a Messiah had to be, as far as the Bible was concerned. Jesus met all the prophecies. He was meeting all the requirements. So it's possible, I suppose, that somebody came to him and convinced him that he was the Messiah, and Jesus went, oh, maybe it is true. But Jesus doesn't talk in the New Testament about maybe. He's convinced. In fact, he's the one convincing other people that he's God. They're not convincing him. Not even his disciples who are close to him are getting the picture that he's the Messiah, that he's God. They kind of get it, but not really. So ultimately, when Jesus claims to be God, I just have to think he's got to be onto something. And it's his resurrection that really seals the deal, that shows that he was right. But I'll talk more about that another time. Let's get back to JoJo's. So for the final little bit here of Jesus' depiction in JoJo's, I want to look at his physical depiction, because I got to point out that Jesus in part 7 is buff. And that's actually kind of cool, not going to lie. I unironically want this to be printed out and hanging on my wall someday. A picture of Jesus being just jacked. Now, as cool as it is, not super historically accurate. Jesus is depicted in JoJo's definitely more of like a European descent. He looks white, at least in the colored manga anyway. Maybe in the anime they'll change that, or he's meant to be dark skinned, but I think in the manga he definitely is supposed to look more white. And he looks pretty tall as well, like very tall. Maybe that was just perspective, but he certainly seems like the kind of tall white dude that you tend to see in European depictions of Jesus. Of course, Jesus in real life would have been a short Jewish man who was brown, and according to Isaiah, he probably just looked like a normal person. He didn't really look stunningly handsome like he's depicted sometimes. Although, the key part here about him being buff, probably actually true. Jesus was a carpenter for over 20 years. That job includes a lot of heavy labor, so Jesus was probably pretty fit, probably had some muscle on him. Now, did he have a 15-pack of abs on his back? Probably not, but he was probably a little buff, not gonna lie. I also want to talk about the depiction of Jesus and how he acts. We don't see much of actual Jesus, except for his kind of spirit who hangs around and talks to Johnny a little bit a few times. And I think early on, when Johnny Tusk is talking to Johnny, it might be Jesus. That's confusing. I'm not going to get much into that, but Jesus is I really like this depiction. This is probably the best part of the depiction of Jesus in JoJo Part 7, because Jesus is a counselor. He's counseling Johnny. He's saying, don't shoot unless like you're certain. He's trying to help Johnny. He's on the side of good, of course. And just seeing Jesus being like a counselor and showing up when Johnny's having a hard time and like putting a hand on his shoulder and telling him like what to do is very much a true thing that Jesus really does to us. In real life, Jesus is a great counselor for all of us. When we're going through a tough time, Jesus is there to put our hand on our shoulder and look really buff and cool and tell us what to do. Sometimes tell us what not to do. Don't shoot if you're feeling nervous. If you don't think you can do it, then don't do it. So I really loved this part in JoJo's Part 7. In fact, it's probably my favorite scene in the entirety of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Parts 1 through 8. My favorite scene by far is Buff Jesus counseling Johnny Joestar. Not something I ever thought I would read, but I loved it. And again, that's got to be on my wall someday. Put it right up next to that painting. So I brought up earlier that I'm not really sure why Jesus died in JoJo's. He seems to have been crucified, and we're led to believe that he lived the same life in JoJo's as he did on Earth in real life, because he did miracles and was an exceptionally awesome, good person, we're told. So if he has so much in common with the real Jesus, but he wasn't God, then what was he killed for? We're not really told. Maybe there's another reason. Maybe there's an evil stand user, Pontius Pilate, involved. But we're just not told. Again, short story, short manga, spin-off manga. Someone get on that. But we're not told. So to end off the video, I'll just get a little bit more into why Jesus died in real life. It's true that he died primarily because he was claiming to be God, and people saw that as really sacrilegious and blasphemous, the Jewish people, and so they killed him. But there's a much, much bigger reason as to why Jesus died that's much, much more important to us today. Jesus died as a substitutional sacrifice for all of humanity for the rest of time. What does that mean exactly? It means that even though we deserve to die, Jesus died for us, and he died for all of us. Throughout the Old Testament, there were lots of animal sacrifices, which is something that we see commonly all over the world. And I think that stems from our human understanding that all humans share, that we just know that we've done wrong and we've got to make up for it, but we don't know how to make up for it, so we just try to sacrifice something. And the issue with animal sacrifices is they're just not perfect, they're incomplete, and if they do work, they only work for a little while and for a few people. Jesus steps in to be the perfect version of a sacrifice, a perfect sacrifice. He does this because he lives a sinless life, so he's a perfect person, a sinless person, and thus the only possible sacrifice so the only possible sacrifice that could actually fully work for all time, so that another sacrifice would never be needed. And the sacrifice is so perfect, it covers the sins of people who haven't even lived yet. Jesus died for me, and it would still be almost 2,000 years before I would even live. If you read the New Testament, it's pretty clear that Jesus had multiple opportunities to avoid death, to avoid the crucifixion. There are many, many times when he could have avoided it and gotten away and continued to live, but he knew it was going to happen to him, and he let it happen because he in a sense, he wanted it to happen. He came down to earth so that it could happen. It wasn't something he was going to run away from. He knew it was something that needed to happen. Because if it didn't, then humanity would just be lost forever. In JoJo's, when you come in contact with a body part of Jesus, it kind of fuses into you. It comes inside your body, and you gain power because of it, which is pretty cool because in real life, that's not too far off from the truth. When we come in contact with Jesus, when we start following him and become Christians, the Bible tells us that Jesus comes to live inside of us, make a home in our hearts, and we are granted powers because of that. Now, they might not be awesome, cool stand powers. They're more like, powers of empathy, kind-heartedness, love, casting out demons, that sort of stuff. And the best part about it is you don't need to go find a devil's palm to have that happen. You don't need to go searching out for mummified corpse parts. You can have an encounter with Jesus right now in the comfort of your own room. I think if we're being honest with ourselves, everybody knows that we've made mistakes in the past, we've done bad things in the past, and maybe we still feel guilty, maybe we don't, but we know that on some level, we've done bad and maybe haven't paid for it. Maybe we got away with it. Everybody likes to believe that their good deeds outweigh their bad deeds, but I don't believe that's the way morality works. I don't think morality is a scale. I think it's more of a sinless person takes all kind of a deal. But thankfully, even though we messed up, even though we've done bad things and deserve a punishment, Jesus has already taken that punishment on himself, and if we trust in that and believe that that happened, then we don't have to face a punishment at all. We can be free. And we probably can't shoot our fingernails or throw around spitting balls of superpowers, but we can be free. And I think that's all we need. If there's anything I missed, let me know. I'll be back soon with talking more about part 7. There's still so much to cover. It's such a dense story, part 7 is, and the more I look at it, the more I read it, the more there is to talk about, the deeper it seems, and there's so much I can talk about that no one else is talking about. I've only seen like one video talking about part 7 and JoJo's in relation to Christianity, and it wasn't very good, I'll put it that way. So I'm excited to start this little mini series, and let me know what else you'd like to see me talk about, and thank you for watching. If you watched all the way through that whole video, let me just give you a thank you. Thank you very much for that. Make sure to leave a like and tell me what you thought. I'll see you in the next video.